My wife and I agreed. "You're not welcome at the baby shower," my son texted. I replied, "I understand." Then I removed their names from the nursery trust. 36 hours later, 72 missed calls and one desperate voicemail from him sobbing. But let me start from the beginning, because the pain didn't begin with that text message. It began 6 months ago when I buried my husband of 42 years. Harold died on a Tuesday morning in March. One moment he was drinking his coffee, reading the financial section like he had every morning for decades, and the next he was gone. The doctors said it was his heart, but I knew better. Harold died of completeness. He had lived exactly the life he wanted, loved exactly who he meant to love, and when his time came, he simply let go. I, on the other hand, was left holding pieces I didn't know how to put back together. David, my only child, cried at the funeral. He held my hand during the service and promised he'd take care of me. Jennifer, his wife of 8 years, rubbed my back and whispered that they'd never let me feel alone. I believed them because I needed to believe them.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
Because the alternative was a grief so vast, I might disappear into it entirely. For the first month after Harold's death, they were wonderful. David called every other day. Jennifer stopped by with casseroles and stayed to chat about her job at the marketing firm. When they told me in May that they were expecting their first child, I cried tears of joy. This baby would be Harold's legacy, the grandchild he'd dreamed of holding. I threw myself into preparing for this grandchild with the intensity of someone who desperately needed purpose. I researched cribs and car seats with the thoroughness Harold used to apply to investment portfolios. I bought soft blankets in gender-neutral yellows and greens. I had already started knitting tiny sweaters, imagining myself teaching this child to bake cookies and tie shoes, the way I had with David. The baby shower was supposed to be in 3 weeks. Jennifer had mentioned it casually 2 months ago, and I'd been planning ever since. I'd found the perfect gift, an antique rocking chair that had been in Harold's family for 4 generations. I'd had it restored, the wood polished to a warm honey shine, imagining Jennifer rocking my grandchild in the same chair where Harold's grandmother had rocked his father. That's why David's text felt like a physical blow. I read it 3 times, sitting in my kitchen at the small table where Harold and I used to eat breakfast together. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and I felt something inside me go very quiet and very still. My wife and I agreed. You're not welcome at the baby shower. No explanation, no apology. Just a statement delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never considered how their words might land. I called David immediately. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "Hi, this is David. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." "David, it's Mom. I got your text about the shower. I'm confused. Did I do something wrong? Please call me back." He didn't call back that day, or the next. On the 3rd day, Jennifer finally answered when I called their house. "Oh, hi, Margaret." Her voice was different somehow, cooler than it had been just weeks before. "I was wondering when you'd call." "Jennifer, I don't understand what happened. David said I'm not welcome at the shower, but he won't return my calls." There was a pause, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "Margaret, we need to be honest with you. You've been difficult lately, since Harold passed away. We understand you're grieving, but it's been affecting everyone around you." I gripped the phone tighter. "Difficult how? You call too much. You want to be involved in every decision about the baby. You cry at inappropriate times. Last week at dinner, you started sobbing when we mentioned painting the nursery because Harold would have loved to help. It made everyone uncomfortable." The words hit me like cold water. I had cried that night, remembering how Harold had painted David's nursery 43 years ago. How excited he'd been about becoming a grandfather. But inappropriate? The grief was still so fresh, so raw, that sometimes it ambushed me in ordinary moments. "Jennifer, I'm sorry if I've been emotional. I'm still learning how to live without him. We know, and we sympathize. But David and I need this shower to be a celebration, not a therapy session. We've invited our friends, people from work, my family. We need to think about the atmosphere we're creating." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar sting of tears I was apparently not supposed to shed. So I'm uninvited from my own grandchild's baby shower because I'm too sad about losing my husband? Margaret, please don't be dramatic. This is exactly what we're talking about. You make everything about you and your grief. The accusation hung between us like a physical thing. I thought about the past 6 months, about how I'd tried so hard to be helpful without being intrusive, to be present without being overwhelming. Apparently, I'd failed at both. I understand, I said quietly, because what else was there to say? After I hung up, I sat in Harold's chair in the living room, surrounded by the silence that had become my constant companion. I looked at the baby gifts I'd been accumulating, the carefully chosen items that now felt presumptuous. I thought about the shower happening without me, Jennifer's friends cooing over tiny clothes while I sat alone in this house full of memories. That's when I remembered something Harold had said during one of our last conversations before he died. We'd been talking about the future, about what would happen to me when he was gone. Margaret, he'd said, his voice already weakened by the illness we didn't yet know was there. Never let anyone make you feel small. You're stronger than you know, and you have more power than you think. I hadn't understood what he meant then, but sitting in his chair, feeling dismissed and diminished by my own family, I began to understand. Harold had always been the one who handled our finances, our investments, our planning for the future, but he'd made sure I knew everything, made sure I understood exactly what we'd built together over 4 decades of marriage, including the trust fund we'd established for our future grandchildren, a fund David had no idea existed. I walked to Harold's desk and pulled out the folder labeled Estate Planning. Inside were documents David had never seen, accounts he'd never heard of, provisions Harold and I had made for children who weren't even born yet. The nursery trust contained $2.3 million. I picked up my phone and typed carefully, "I understand." Then I called our attorney. Robert Hutchinson had been Harold's attorney for 27 years, and mine by extension. When I called his office that Thursday afternoon, his secretary put me through immediately. "Margaret, I'm so sorry about Harold. I meant to call sooner, but I wanted to give you time to settle into your new circumstances. Thank you, Robert. I'm calling about the nursery trust." There was a brief pause. "Ah, has the situation with David's family changed?" "You could say that. Would you like to come in tomorrow morning? We should discuss this in person." I agreed to meet him at 10 o'clock. Then spent the rest of the afternoon remembering how that trust had come to exist. It was 15 years ago, not long after David had married Jennifer. Harold and I were in our early 50s then, successful but not wealthy by any dramatic measure. Harold had built his accounting practice slowly and steadily, and I had worked as a school administrator until David graduated college. We lived comfortably but modestly, saving what we could, investing carefully. Then Harold's practice exploded almost overnight. 3 large corporations had hired his firm within 6 months of each other, and suddenly we were managing more money than we'd ever imagined having. Harold, being Harold, didn't change our lifestyle dramatically. We paid off the house, bought a newer car, took a nice vacation to Europe. But the bulk of the money went into investments and trusts. "We need to think about the future," Harold had said one evening as we reviewed our financial situation. "About David's children, about the legacy we want to leave." "David doesn't even want children yet," I'd reminded him. He and Jennifer had been married only 2 years then, and they were focused on their careers. They will, and when they do, I want those children to have advantages we didn't have. I want them to go to the best schools, to have opportunities, to never worry about money the way we did when David was young. So we'd established the nursery trust. Harold had been specific about the terms. The money was for direct descendants, to be used for education, healthcare, and general welfare. The trust could be modified or dissolved at any time by either of us while we were alive, or by me alone after Harold's death. David didn't know about it because Harold believed in earning what you had. If David knows there's money waiting for his children, he might not work as hard to provide for them himself, Harold had reasoned. Let him be a father first. When the children come, we'll tell him about the trust. But then Harold died before our grandchildren were born, and the knowledge of that trust became mine alone to carry. Robert's office was in the same building where he'd practiced for 30 years, all dark wood and leather-bound books that smelled like old paper and serious conversations. He greeted me with the careful kindness people use around the recently widowed, offered me coffee I didn't want, and settled behind his desk with a thick file folder. "The nursery trust is currently valued at $2.3 million, he began without preamble. Harold was quite specific about the terms. "As the surviving trustee, you have complete discretion over all aspects of the fund." I nodded, though hearing the number aloud still made me feel slightly dizzy. Harold and I had never talked about money in those terms. We'd lived our lives thinking in hundreds and thousands, not millions. What exactly does that mean, complete discretion? It means you can modify the beneficiaries, change the terms of distribution, or dissolve the trust entirely. The money would revert to your personal estate if you chose to dissolve it. And David has no legal claim to it? None whatsoever. The trust was established for his potential children, not for him. If those children are removed as beneficiaries, David has no standing to contest it. I thought about this for a moment, imagining David's reaction when he discovered what had been planned for his children. What had been planned before his wife decided I was too grief-stricken to attend their baby shower. "Robert, I want to change the beneficiaries." He picked up his pen and pulled a legal pad toward him. "Who would you like to add?" "I don't want to add anyone. I want to remove David's children." Robert's pen stopped moving. He looked at me with the expression of someone who was trying to choose his words very carefully. "Margaret, I have to ask if this decision is being made in the heat of emotion. Grief can sometimes—" "This isn't about grief," I interrupted, though of course it was partially about grief. Everything had been about grief for 6 months. This is about being treated with respect by my own family. I told him about the text message, about Jennifer's phone call, about being deemed too difficult and emotional to attend my own grandchild's baby shower. As I spoke, Robert's expression grew increasingly grim. "I see," he said when I finished. "And you're certain this is what you want to do?" "I want to remove David's children as beneficiaries today. If he can change his mind about including me in his family, I can change my mind about including his children in my financial planning." Robert nodded slowly. "There are several options for redirecting the funds. We could establish educational scholarships, donate to charities, or simply transfer the money to your personal estate." "Transfer it to my estate for now. I need time to think about what I want to do with it ultimately." "That's easily done. I'll have the paperwork ready by Monday." "Make it today," I said. "I want this done today." Robert glanced at his watch. It was nearly noon on Friday. "Margaret, this is a significant decision. Perhaps you should take the weekend to consider—" "Robert, my son sent me a text message uninviting me from my grandchild's baby shower because his wife thinks I'm too emotional about losing my husband. I've had 6 months to consider how my family treats me. I don't need another weekend." He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll have the documents ready by 4 o'clock this afternoon." While Robert prepared the paperwork, I drove home and walked through the house Harold and I had shared for 38 years. Every room held memories of David growing up, of the 3 of us as a family, his first steps in the living room, birthday parties in the dining room, Christmas mornings around the tree by the front window. In David's old bedroom, which I'd left largely unchanged even after he moved out, I found photo albums from his childhood. Page after page of pictures. David on Harold's shoulders at the zoo, David and me baking cookies in the kitchen, the 3 of us on vacation at the beach. We'd been happy then. Genuinely happy. We'd been a family. I paused at a picture of David's college graduation. Harold and I stood on either side of him, beaming with pride. David's arm was around my shoulders, and he was looking at me with such love and gratitude. When had that changed? When had I become someone to be managed rather than someone to be loved? Maybe it had started gradually after Harold's death. Maybe Jennifer's influence had been subtler than I'd realized. Or maybe this was simply who David had always been underneath, and grief had stripped away my ability to make excuses for him. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my heart leaped, thinking it might be David calling to apologize. to explain that there had been some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, it was Jennifer. "Margaret, I hope you understand that our decision about the shower isn't personal. We just want what's best for everyone." I stared at the message for a long time. Not personal, as if excluding a grandmother from her grandchild's celebration could be anything other than deeply personal. I typed back, "I understand completely." At 4 o'clock, I signed the papers that removed David's future children from the nursery trust. $2.3 million that had been earmarked for their education, their health care, their opportunities, now reverted to my personal estate. Money that Harold and I had carefully saved and invested for grandchildren we'd never meet was no longer theirs. Robert walked me to my car afterward. "Margaret, you know this decision isn't irreversible. If circumstances change, if relationships improve, we can always establish a new trust." "I know," I said. "But right now, I need my family to understand that love and respect can't be taken for granted. And if they don't understand..." I thought about Harold, about what he'd said about never letting anyone make me feel small, about the power I had and didn't know I possessed. Then they'll learn that actions have consequences. That evening, I called my sister Claire in Phoenix. We'd been close growing up but had drifted apart over the years as our lives took different paths. She'd never married, had built a successful career in real estate, and had always been the strong, independent one in our family. "Margaret, I was just thinking about you. How are you holding up?" I told her everything. About Harold's death, about David and Jennifer's treatment of me, about the trust fund they didn't know existed, about my decision to remove their children as beneficiaries. Claire was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she said, "Good for you. Really? You don't think I'm being vindictive? I think you're being smart. Harold always said you were tougher than you looked. Maybe it's time David learned that too." We talked for another hour. About Harold, about grief, about the ways families can hurt each other without meaning to, or sometimes meaning to very much. "You know what I think?" Claire said as we were ending the call. "I think Harold would be proud of you. He never tolerated disrespect from anyone, and he wouldn't want you to tolerate it either." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet house thinking about the baby shower that would happen tomorrow without me. Jennifer's friends would gather, bringing gifts and good wishes, celebrating the new life that was coming. David would probably make a speech about how grateful they were for everyone's support. They would eat cake and play games and take pictures that would be treasured for years. And I would be absent from all of it, erased from this milestone moment in my grandchild's life before that child was even born. But I would also be free. Free from pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. Free from swallowing my hurt to keep the peace. Free from making myself smaller to accommodate people who saw my grief as an inconvenience rather than a natural response to losing the love of my life. The baby shower was tomorrow. By Sunday evening, when the excitement died down and reality set in, David and Jennifer would probably call to smooth things over, to make sure I wasn't too upset about missing the celebration. They had no idea what they had set in motion with that casual text message. They had no idea that the quiet, accommodating woman they'd dismissed was sitting on a financial foundation they couldn't imagine. But they were about to find out. The baby shower was on Saturday. I spent the day in my garden, pulling weeds and planting the late-season bulbs Harold had ordered before he died. Working with my hands in the soil he'd enriched over decades felt like having a conversation with him, like he was still there guiding me through this strange new chapter of my life. My phone rang twice. Both times it was David's number, and both times I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear his voice yet, wasn't ready for whatever explanation or non-apology he might offer. The wounds were too fresh, and I needed the silence to think clearly about what came next. Sunday passed quietly. I went to church, where several people asked about David and Jennifer and the upcoming baby. I smiled and said they were doing well, because what else could I say? That my son had uninvited me from my grandchild's baby shower because his wife found my grief inconvenient? By Sunday evening, I'd received 4 more missed calls from David and 2 text messages. The first said, "Mom, We need to talk. The second, sent 3 hours later, was more urgent. Please call me back. It's important. I didn't call back. Monday morning brought rain and Robert Hutchinson's phone call confirming that all the paperwork had been filed. The nursery trust was officially dissolved, and the money had been transferred to my personal estate. David's future children were no longer beneficiaries of anything beyond what their parents could provide for them. "How are you feeling about the decision?" Robert asked. "At peace," I said, and was surprised to realize it was true. Monday afternoon brought the storm. I was reading in Harold's chair when my phone started ringing. David's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring through to voicemail, as I had been doing since Friday, but then it rang again immediately, and again, and again. By the 6th call, I was concerned that something might be wrong with Jennifer or the baby. I answered on the 7th ring. "Margaret?" David's voice was strange, higher pitched than normal. "Thank God you finally picked up. I've been trying to reach you for days." "I know, I wasn't ready to talk." "We need to talk now. I'm coming over." Something in his tone made my stomach clench. "David, what's wrong? Is Jennifer okay? Is the baby—" "The baby's fine. Jennifer's fine. But we have a serious problem, and I need to understand what's happening." He hung up before I could respond. 20 minutes later, his car pulled into my driveway with a speed that suggested panic rather than casual visiting. David burst through my front door without knocking, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. "Mom, I just came from Dad's attorney's office. Robert Hutchinson called me this morning and asked me to come in for a meeting about estate planning for the baby." I set down my book and folded my hands in my lap, waiting. He told me about a trust fund, a nursery trust that you and Dad set up 15 years ago. $2.3 million, Mom. $2.3 million that was supposed to be for my children. David's voice cracked on the word supposed. He also told me that as of Friday afternoon, that trust no longer exists, that you dissolved it and transferred the money to your personal estate. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who had casually dismissed me from his family's most important celebration via text message. "That's correct. Mom, what the hell is going on? Why didn't you tell me about this money? And why did you take it away?" "I didn't take anything away, David. The trust was never yours to begin with. It was for your children, and only if I chose to maintain it." "But why wouldn't you maintain it? These are your grandchildren we're talking about. Your own blood." I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 67 years in my bones. My own blood, who I'm apparently too emotional to celebrate with. David's face went pale. "This is about the baby shower? You dissolved a multi-million-dollar trust because you were uninvited from a party?" The casualness with which he dismissed my pain took my breath away. A party. As if my exclusion from my grandchild's life was nothing more than a social inconvenience. "Sit down, David." "Mom, I don't want to sit down. I want to understand why you've destroyed my children's future over a misunderstanding." It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a clear message about my place in this family. "Now sit down, or this conversation is over." He sat, perched on the edge of the couch like he might bolt at any moment. "Your father and I created that trust because we wanted your children to have opportunities and security. We wanted them to go to the best schools, to never worry about money, to have advantages we didn't have when you were young." David leaned forward. "Then why are you taking that away from them?" "Because Jennifer made it very clear that I'm not welcome in their lives. That my grief is inappropriate, my emotions are inconvenient, and my presence makes people uncomfortable." "That's not what she meant." "That's exactly what she meant, David. She said I was too difficult, too emotional, too much trouble to include in my own grandchild's baby shower. So I decided that if I'm not welcome in their lives, my money isn't welcome either." David ran his hands through his hair, leaving it standing in wild tufts. "Mom, you're talking about millions of dollars. My children's education, their future, their security. I'm talking about respect, David. About being treated like a human being with feelings instead of an inconvenience to be managed. But the baby shower was just one event. You can't punish my children for one mistake. I walked to the mantelpiece where photos of David's childhood were displayed. I picked up a picture of the three of us from his 8th birthday party, all of us laughing at something Harold had said. When did you stop seeing me as your mother, David? What do you mean? When did I become someone you had to handle instead of someone you wanted to love? He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Mom, I haven't stopped loving you, but you have stopped respecting me. You've stopped considering my feelings. You've let your wife convince you that your grieving mother is a problem to be solved rather than a person to be supported. David's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry about the baby shower. I really am. Jennifer was stressed about the planning and we thought it would be easier if you excluded me rather than dealing with the fact that I'm still sad about losing the love of my life. Yes. No, I don't know. We made a mistake, okay? We made a terrible mistake and I'm sorry. But you can't punish my children for our mistake. I set the photo back on the mantelpiece and turned to face him. I'm not punishing your children, David. I'm protecting myself. For 6 months, I've been trying to figure out how to live without your father. I've been trying to find my place in a world that suddenly feels foreign and frightening. And instead of helping me through that, you've made it clear that my grief is an inconvenience and my presence is unwelcome. That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you visited without wanting something? When was the last time you treated me like your mother instead of like a burden? David opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. We both knew the truth. The trust fund your father and I created was an act of love, David. It was our way of ensuring that our grandchildren would have every advantage in life. But love given without respect received is just enablement. And I won't enable a family that treats me as disposable. Mom, please, we can fix this. Jennifer and I can apologize. We can include you in everything from now on. We can make this right. Can you? Can you really? Because right now, you're not apologizing because you hurt me. You're apologizing because you want something from me. You're here because you found out about the money, not because you realized how badly you treated me. The truth of that statement hung between us like a physical presence. David's shoulders sagged as the reality of it settled over him. What do you want me to say, Mom? I want you to understand that actions have consequences, that people have limits, that even mothers can reach a point where enough is enough. So that's it? You're just going to write off your grandchildren because Jennifer and I made a mistake? I'm not writing off anyone, David. I'm simply choosing not to financially support people who don't emotionally support me. If you and Jennifer want to provide for your children, you'll have to do it the way most parents do, with your own resources and your own efforts. David stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and desperation. This is insane, Mom. You're destroying my family's future over hurt feelings. No, David. You destroyed our relationship over hurt feelings. I'm just responding accordingly. He walked to the window and stood there for a long moment, looking out at the garden where Harold and I had spent so many peaceful evenings together. Dad would hate this, he said finally. Your father would hate the way you've treated me. He spent 42 years making sure I felt loved and valued and protected. He would be appalled to know that his son thinks so little of me that he can dismiss me from his family via text message. David turned around, tears streaming down his face. What can I do, Mom? Tell me what I can do to fix this. For the first time since this conversation began, I felt a flicker of hope, not because he was offering to fix things, but because he was finally asking the right question. You can start by understanding that this isn't about money, David. It's about dignity. It's about being treated with the respect that a lifetime of love and sacrifice should have earned me. And if we do that? If we treat you with respect? Will you restore the trust? I looked at my son, this man who was still, even now, trying to negotiate his way to my money rather than simply committing to loving me better. Ask me that question again in 6 months, I said. After you've shown me that you value me for who I am, not for what I can give you. David left that afternoon with slumped shoulders and a promise to call Jennifer immediately. I watched his car disappear down the street and wondered if I'd just saved my family or destroyed it completely. Only time would tell. The silence that followed David's departure was different from the quiet I'd grown accustomed to since Harold's death. This wasn't the empty silence of loss, but the charged stillness that comes after a storm has passed, and you're waiting to see what damage has been done. I didn't have to wait long. Jennifer called that evening, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Margaret, David told me about your conversation today. I think we need to clear the air." "Do we?" "Yes, we do, because this situation has gotten completely out of hand, and it's affecting my family's future." I noticed she said, "my family," not "our family." Even in crisis, Jennifer couldn't bring herself to include me. "Jennifer, I've said everything I need to say. David understands my position. Your position is ridiculous and vindictive. You're punishing an unborn child because you didn't get invited to a party." There it was again. A party. As if my grandchild's baby shower was nothing more than a casual social gathering I'd been petty enough to get upset about missing. "I'm not punishing anyone, Jennifer. I'm simply choosing how to spend my own money. Money that was meant for our children. Money that Harold wanted his grandchildren to have. Harold also wanted his wife to be treated with love and respect. Apparently, we can't have both." There was a long pause. When Jennifer spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming the carefully modulated tone she used in her marketing presentations. "Margaret, I think we got off on the wrong foot after Harold's passing. Grief affects everyone differently, and maybe I didn't handle your grieving process as sensitively as I should have." It was masterful, really. An apology that wasn't quite an apology, acknowledging my grief while simultaneously labeling it as something that needed to be handled. "Thank you for saying that, Jennifer. So can we move forward? Can we put this behind us and focus on what's best for the baby? What do you think would be best for the baby? Having financial security, having grandparents who are involved and supportive, having a family that works together instead of against each other." I agree completely. A baby should have grandparents who are involved and supportive. Then you'll restore the trust fund? I'll consider it when I have grandparents who are involved and supportive. Another long pause. I could almost hear Jennifer recalibrating, trying to figure out how to manage this new version of me that wouldn't be managed. "What exactly do you want from us, Margaret?" "I want to be treated like David's mother instead of like an inconvenience. I want my grief to be respected instead of managed. I want to be included in my grandchild's life from the beginning, not grudgingly accommodated when it's convenient. And if we do that, you'll give us the money back?" Even now, even in what was supposed to be a reconciliation conversation, it all came back to the money. "Jennifer, if you and David can show me that you value me as a person and not as a bank account, we can discuss the future. But right now, your primary concern seems to be my financial resources, not my emotional well-being. That's not fair. Of course we care about you. Do you? Because in 6 months of widowhood, you've never once asked me how I'm coping with losing Harold. You've never asked if I'm lonely or scared or struggling with learning to live alone. You've complained about my emotions, managed my involvement in your lives, and ultimately decided I was too much trouble to include in your celebration. That doesn't feel like caring to me." The silence stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. "Margaret," she finally said, and for the first time since Harold's funeral, Jennifer's voice sounded genuinely uncertain. "I didn't realize, I thought you were doing okay. You always seemed so strong. I was trying to be strong because I thought that's what you needed from me. But strong doesn't mean I don't hurt, Jennifer. It doesn't mean I don't need my family's support and love. I'm sorry, I really am. I think we both made mistakes." It was the closest thing to a real apology I'd gotten from either of them. "Thank you for saying that. So where do we go from here?" "We start over. We build a relationship based on mutual respect instead of assumptions and expectations, and we see what happens." After Jennifer hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a tiny spark of hope. Not hope that everything would go back to the way it was before Harold died, because that world was gone forever, but hope that something new and maybe even better could take its place. The next few weeks brought small changes that felt enormous in the context of our damaged relationship. David called twice a week, not because he wanted something, but to check on me. Jennifer sent me ultrasound pictures and asked for my opinion on nursery colors. They invited me to dinner, and actually seemed interested in hearing about my day. It felt tentative and careful, like we were all learning a new language. But it also felt real in a way our interactions hadn't for months. Then, 3 weeks after our confrontation, David showed up at my door on a Saturday morning looking haggard and desperate. "Mom, we need to talk." My heart sank. I'd been so hopeful that we were making progress, but the expression on David's face suggested otherwise. "What's wrong? Can I come in?" I led him to the kitchen and made coffee while he sat at the table where Harold and I had shared thousands of meals together. David's hands were shaking as he accepted the mug I offered him. "Jennifer left me." The words hit me like cold water. "What do you mean, left you?" "She moved out yesterday, took all her things, and went to stay with her sister in Portland." I sat down across from him, trying to process this information. "David, what happened?" "She said she can't stay married to someone whose mother has that much control over their future. She said as long as you're holding the trust fund hostage, she can't trust that our children will have the security they deserve. She left you because of the money?" David's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Apparently, that's what it all comes down to. The money, not me, not our marriage, not the baby we're supposed to be having together. Just the money you took away." I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. "David, I'm so sorry. Are you? Because part of me wonders if this is what you wanted all along. If you knew this would happen when you dissolved the trust." The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth in it. I'd known that taking away their financial expectations would test their relationship, but I'd hoped it would strengthen them, force them to rely on each other instead of on money they'd never actually had. "I wanted you to value me for who I am, not for what I could give you. I never wanted your marriage to end, but you knew it might. I knew that a marriage built on financial expectations rather than love might not survive without those expectations. I hoped I was wrong." David pulled his hand away from mine and stood up, pacing to the window where he'd stood during our confrontation 3 weeks earlier. "She's threatening to take the baby and move permanently to Portland if I don't get you to restore the trust fund." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that my mother isn't a bank account to be negotiated with. I told her that if she only married me for the money she thought I'd inherit, then maybe it's better that she leaves now." I felt a surge of pride in my son that I hadn't experienced in months. "How do you feel about that decision?" David was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the garden where Harold had taught him to throw a baseball 40 years ago. "Terrified," he said finally, but also relieved. "These past 3 weeks, watching you try to rebuild our relationship, watching you actually care about how I'm doing and what I'm thinking, it made me realize how transactional everything had become with Jennifer, how every conversation was about what we needed, what we wanted, what we planned to get, never about who we were or how we felt." He turned back to face me. "Mom, I owe you an apology. Not because of the money, but because I let my wife convince me that your grief was an inconvenience instead of recognizing it as love. I let her make me forget that you're not just my mother. You're a person who lost the most important relationship in her life and needed her family's support." The tears I'd been holding back for weeks finally came. Not tears of sadness or anger, but tears of relief and recognition. My son was still in there somewhere, underneath the years of Jennifer's influence and his own selfish assumptions. "Thank you for saying that, David. I don't know what's going to happen with Jennifer and the baby. She says she'll come back if you restore the trust, but I can't ask you to do that. I won't ask you to do that. What if I wanted to restore it?" David shook his head. "Not like this. Not as ransom for my marriage or access to my child. If you ever decide to set up money for your grandchildren again, it has to be because you want to, not because you're being coerced." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw Harold's integrity shining through the confusion and pain. Jennifer's departure had stripped away the pretense and revealed the man I'd raised him to be. "What will you do now?" "I don't know. Try to convince Jennifer that we can build a good life together without depending on money that was never ours to begin with. Try to be the kind of father Dad was to me, with or without financial advantages. Try to be the kind of son who deserves to have you in his life. You've always deserved to have me in your life, David. That was never in question, wasn't it? Because looking back at these past 6 months, I'm not sure I would have wanted me in my life either. We talked until late afternoon. Really talked in a way we hadn't since before Harold's death. David told me about the pressure he'd felt to provide the lifestyle Jennifer expected, how he'd convinced himself that my emotional needs were secondary to keeping his wife happy. I told him about the loneliness and fear I'd experienced since losing Harold, how I'd interpreted his distance as rejection rather than his own struggle with grief. When he finally left, I felt something I hadn't felt since the morning I'd found Harold unresponsive in his chair. I felt like I had my son back, but I also knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Jennifer held all the cards when it came to my future relationship with my grandchild, and she'd made it clear that my money was more important to her than my son's happiness. The question now was whether David would choose his child's mother or his own mother, and whether I was strong enough to live with whatever choice he made. For 2 months, David and I existed in a strange limbo. Jennifer remained in Portland with her sister, communicating with David only through text messages about doctor's appointments and ultrasound results. She refused to speak to me at all, despite David's attempts to facilitate a conversation. During this time, I watched my son transform into someone I barely recognized, but in the best possible way. The entitled, distracted man who had casually uninvited me from his child's baby shower was slowly being replaced by someone who resembled the thoughtful boy I'd raised. David started coming by every Sunday for dinner, not because he felt obligated, but because he genuinely seemed to enjoy our conversations. We talked about Harold's death and how it had affected both of us. We talked about David's fears about becoming a father without a strong marriage to support him. We talked about mistakes we'd both made and how we wanted to do better. "I keep thinking about Dad," David said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner, about how he made everything look so easy. Being a husband, being a father, being a son. I don't remember him ever making you feel unimportant or unwanted. "Your father worked very hard at our relationship," I said. "He didn't just assume I knew he loved me. He showed me every day in small ways and big ones. I stopped showing you, didn't I? I started taking you for granted. We both got lazy, David. I should have spoken up sooner when I felt excluded instead of swallowing my hurt and hoping things would change." These conversations were healing something in both of us that had been broken long before Harold's death. We were rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of honesty instead of assumptions. But Jennifer's silence hung over everything like a storm cloud. She was due in 6 weeks, and David had no idea if he'd be allowed in the delivery room or if he'd even be notified when the baby was born. "She can't keep me from my child forever," David said one afternoon, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, she can't. But she can make it very difficult for a very long time. Do you think I should go to Portland? Try to talk to her in person?" I considered this carefully. "What would you say if you went?" "That I love her, that I want our family to work, that we can build a good life together even without the trust fund money." "And if she says she won't come back without the money?" David was quiet for a long moment. "Then I guess I'll know where I really stand in her priorities." 3 weeks later, he made that trip to Portland. I spent the weekend he was gone alternating between hope and dread, praying that Jennifer would choose love over money, but preparing myself for the possibility that she wouldn't. David returned on Sunday evening, and I knew from his expression that the news wasn't good. "She won't come back," he said without preamble. "She's filed for divorce and wants full custody. She says she can't trust me to provide for our child's future." I felt my heart break for my son, but also felt a surge of anger at Jennifer's calculated cruelty. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that our child would be provided for, just not in the way she expected. I told her I'd rather raise my child in a modest home filled with love than in a mansion built on someone else's money." "How did she respond to that?" David's smile was bitter. "She said I was being naive and idealistic. She said children need security, not sentiment." "And what do you think?" "I think she's forgotten that some of the happiest children grow up in families that don't have trust funds." I think she's confused security with luxury. Over the next month, as Jennifer's due date approached, David threw himself into preparing for single fatherhood. He read parenting books, took childcare classes, and converted his spare bedroom into a nursery. He did all of this knowing he might not get to use any of it, but determined to be ready if the opportunity arose. "She can't keep the baby from me permanently," he said one evening as we assembled a crib together. "I have rights as the father." "Yes, you do. But exercising those rights could mean years of legal battles and a child caught in the middle." "Then what do you think I should do?" I looked at my son, this man who had finally learned to put relationships before money, and felt a pride so deep it made my chest ache. "I think you should keep being the man your father raised you to be. Keep showing up. Keep trying. Keep loving your child even from a distance. And trust that eventually, Jennifer will realize what she's throwing away. And if she doesn't, then your child will grow up knowing that their father never stopped fighting for them." The call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in late October. David's phone rang, and when he answered, Jennifer's voice was strained and scared. "David, I'm in labor. I'm at Portland General Hospital." He was dressed and in his car within 10 minutes, calling me from the road. "Mom, she called me. She wants me there." "Of course she does. She's scared and alone, and despite everything, you're still the father of her child. What if this is just temporary? What if she only wants me there for the birth and then goes back to shutting me out? Then at least you'll have been there for your child's first moments. That's worth something." David was gone for 5 days. I spent those days in a state of suspended animation, waiting for news about my grandchild, and wondering if I'd ever get to meet this baby who had already caused so much upheaval in our family. When David finally called, his voice was thick with exhaustion and emotion. "Mom, you have a granddaughter, Sarah Margaret, 8 pounds, 2 ounces, and absolutely perfect." I started crying before he finished speaking. "Sarah Margaret?" Jennifer chose Sarah. I chose Margaret. For you. The fact that Jennifer had agreed to name the baby after me suggested that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for reconciliation. How is Jennifer? Tired, scared, different somehow. Having Sarah has changed her perspective on some things. Different how? She's been asking about you. About whether you're angry with her. About whether you'd want to meet Sarah? My heart leaped. What did you tell her? I told her that you've been waiting to meet your granddaughter since the moment we announced the pregnancy. I told her that despite everything that's happened, you love this baby because she's part of our family. And what did Jennifer say? She cried, and then she asked me to ask you something. I waited, hardly daring to breathe. She wants to know if you'd be willing to come to Portland. Not to talk about money or trust funds or any of that. Just to meet Sarah and maybe start over. The invitation I'd been hoping for since that terrible text message 8 months ago had finally come. But it came with no guarantees, no promises about the future, no assurance that this fragile peace would last. Tell Jennifer that I'll be on the first flight to Portland tomorrow. Mom, I need you to know that I'm not asking you to restore the trust fund. Jennifer and I need to work out our relationship on our own terms, not because of financial incentives. I know, David, and I'm proud of you for saying that. But I also need you to know that I hope someday you'll want to help provide for Sarah's future. Not because you have to, but because you want to. I looked around the house Harold and I had built together, thinking about the legacy we'd wanted to leave and the family we'd hoped to create. David, your father and I established that trust fund because we wanted our grandchildren to have every possible advantage in life. But the most important advantage we can give Sarah isn't money. It's love. It's family. It's knowing that she's wanted and valued and cherished. So you'll consider restoring the trust? I'll consider a lot of things once I meet my granddaughter and see what kind of family we can build together. But David, any financial support I provide in the future will be because Sarah has grandparents who love her, not because her parents demand it. The next morning, I boarded a plane to Portland carrying a bag filled with gifts I'd been collecting for months. Tiny clothes in soft pastels, board books with simple stories, a stuffed elephant that played lullabies. But the most important thing I carried was hope that this new little person might be the bridge that helped our fractured family find its way back to love. As the plane lifted off, I thought about Harold and how proud he would be of the man David had become. I thought about the scared young woman waiting in Portland who had learned that some things were more valuable than money. And I thought about Sarah Margaret, who would never know how close her family had come to destroying itself before she brought them back together. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to prove they've changed. Jennifer was about to get that chance, and so was I. The hospital room was smaller than I'd expected, filled with the soft sounds of machines monitoring new life. Jennifer looked impossibly young, propped up in the narrow bed, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, dark circles under her eyes. But when she saw me in the doorway, something in her expression shifted from wariness to something that might have been relief. "Margaret," she said quietly, "thank you for coming." David stood beside the bed holding a tiny bundle wrapped in pink and white stripes. When he turned toward me, his face was radiant with the kind of joy I hadn't seen since he was a child on Christmas morning. "Mom, meet your granddaughter." I approached slowly, as if sudden movements might shatter this fragile moment of peace. When David placed Sarah in my arms, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. This tiny person, barely 3 days old, had Harold's nose and David's chin and eyes that seemed to look right through me to my soul. "Hello, sweet girl," I whispered, and her tiny fingers wrapped around my thumb with surprising strength. I looked up to find Jennifer watching me with tears in her eyes. "She's beautiful," I said. "Absolutely perfect." "I'm sorry," Jennifer said suddenly, the words tumbling out like she'd been holding them back for months. "I'm so sorry, Margaret, for everything, for the baby shower, for the things I said, for keeping David away from you when you needed him most." I shifted Sarah to one arm and reached out to take Jennifer's hand with the other. "We both made mistakes, honey. We both forgot that we're supposed to be on the same side." I was so focused on what I thought Sarah would need that I forgot what she actually needs most: a family that loves each other instead of fights with each other. David sat down in the chair beside Jennifer's bed, and for the first time in almost a year, the three of us were in the same room without tension crackling between us. "Where do we go from here?" Jennifer asked. "We start over," I said, looking down at Sarah, who had fallen asleep in my arms. "We build something new that works for all of us." Over the next 3 days, while Jennifer recovered and gained strength, I stayed in a hotel nearby and spent hours at the hospital. I watched David change diapers with the careful concentration of someone performing surgery. I saw Jennifer's fierce protectiveness when Sarah cried, and her wonder when the baby slept peacefully in her arms. But mostly, I held my granddaughter and told her stories about the grandfather she would never meet, but whose love would always be part of her life. "Harold would have spoiled her rotten," I told David one afternoon as we sat in the hospital cafeteria while Jennifer napped. "He would have taught her to fish and let her help in the garden, and probably would have built her a treehouse before she could even walk." David smiled. "Do you think he would have approved of how I handled everything with Jennifer and the trust fund?" "I think he would have been proud that you chose love over money, that you chose integrity over convenience. Even if it meant losing the money he'd saved for his grandchildren?" I looked through the cafeteria window toward the maternity ward where my granddaughter was sleeping. "David, your father and I didn't save that money so our grandchildren could grow up entitled and dependent. We saved it so they could grow up secure and loved. If keeping that money meant Sarah grew up in a broken family that fought over finances instead of focusing on relationships, Harold would have burned every dollar himself." That evening, Jennifer asked to speak with me privately. David took Sarah for a walk around the maternity ward while Jennifer and I sat in the quiet of her hospital room. "I need to tell you something," she said. "When I left David and went to my sister's house, I spent a lot of time thinking about why I was so angry about the trust fund. It wasn't really about Sarah's security, it was about control." I waited for her to continue. "My parents struggled financially when I was growing up. Not poor, but always worried about money, always stressed about making ends meet. When I married David, I felt like I'd finally found security. And when you took away the trust fund, it felt like I was being pushed back into that uncertainty. I can understand that fear, Jennifer. But what I realized while I was in Portland is that I was trying to control the future instead of building it. I was so focused on what might go wrong that I was destroying what was actually right. She looked toward the door where David's voice could be heard talking softly to Sarah as they walked the halls. David never promised me a trust fund. He never even knew it existed. But he did promise to love me and provide for our family to the best of his ability. And I threw that away because it wasn't enough. Because I wanted guarantees instead of partnership. Relationships don't come with guarantees, honey. They come with commitment. I know that now. And I know that I hurt you terribly because I was afraid and selfish. I don't know if you can forgive me, but I hope you'll give me a chance to do better. I reached over and took her hand. Jennifer, I didn't dissolve that trust fund to punish you. I did it to protect myself from people who valued my money more than my presence. If you and David want to build a life together based on love and mutual respect, you'll have my support in every way I can give it. Including financially? Including everything. 2 weeks later, they came home. Not to Portland, but to the house where David had grown up, 20 minutes from where I lived. Jennifer had found a job with a marketing firm in town, and David had decided to start his own accounting practice rather than continuing with the corporate job that had consumed so much of his time and energy. We want Sarah to grow up knowing her grandmother, Jennifer explained when they told me about their decision. We want her to have the stability of an extended family. The day they moved back, I showed up with casseroles and cleaning supplies and a willingness to help however I could. As I watched David and Jennifer work together to turn their new house into a home, I saw something I'd never seen before, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals. That evening, as we sat in their living room surrounded by boxes and eating takeout pizza, Sarah sleeping peacefully in her bouncer seat, Jennifer brought up the subject I'd been waiting for her to mention. Margaret, I know we haven't talked about the trust fund since Portland, but I want you to know that our decision to move back here wasn't about money. It was about family. I know that, honey. But I also want you to know that if you ever decide to set up something for Sarah's future, David and I would be grateful. Not because we expect it or demand it, but because we know it would come from love. I looked at Sarah, this perfect little person who had already taught her parents so much about what really mattered in life. Actually, I've been thinking about that. Robert Hutchinson and I had a conversation last week about establishing a new trust. David looked up sharply. Mom, you don't have to. I want to, I interrupted. But this time, I want to do it differently. I pulled out a folder I'd brought with me and set it on the coffee table. This new trust isn't just about money, although there will be money in it. It's about values and character and the kind of person I hope Sarah grows up to be. I opened the folder and showed them the documents Robert had prepared. The financial component is there, but it's tied to milestones that have nothing to do with academic achievement or career success. Sarah will receive portions of the trust when she demonstrates kindness, when she shows respect for her elders, when she puts family relationships before material gain. Jennifer leaned forward to read the documents. How do you measure something like kindness? The same way I measured your character over these past few months. By watching how you treat the people you love when it's difficult to love them. By seeing whether you choose what's easy or what's right when those things are different. David was quiet for a long moment, reading through the trust provisions. Mom, this is incredibly generous, but it's also incredibly complicated. How will you determine if Sarah meets these character requirements? I won't, I said. You and Jennifer will. This trust is as much about you learning to prioritize the right things as it is about Sarah's future. I pointed to a specific clause in the document. The trust requires annual family evaluations where you assess not just Sarah's development, but your own growth as parents and partners. If you're not modeling the values you want Sarah to learn, the trust goes into suspension until you are. Jennifer looked up from the documents with tears in her eyes. You're not just giving Sarah a financial inheritance. You're giving all of us a framework for staying connected to what matters. That's exactly right. Harold and I learned the hard way that money without relationship is meaningless. This trust ensures that Sarah grows up understanding that love and character are more valuable than any bank account. Over the following months, as I watched David and Jennifer navigate new parenthood while building their life together, I saw the wisdom of Harold's original instinct about delayed gratification. They struggled sometimes, budgeting carefully and making sacrifices that couples with more resources didn't have to make, but those struggles brought them closer together, instead of driving them apart. Sarah, meanwhile, grew into a happy, healthy baby, who was clearly the center of her parents' universe. I spent every Sunday at their house, helping with laundry and cooking while David and Jennifer caught up on sleep or simply enjoyed each other's company. "She looks like Harold when she smiles," I told David one afternoon as we watched Sarah discover her own toes. "She has his temperament too, patient and observant. He would have been so proud of the father you've become." David looked at me with the kind of gratitude that doesn't need words. "I hope I can be half the parent to Sarah that you and Dad were to me. You're already better than that. Honey, you're present in ways I sometimes wasn't when you were young. You're intentional about building relationship instead of just assuming it will happen." 6 months after Sarah's birth, Jennifer surprised me with a request that brought everything full circle. "Margaret, would you help me plan Sarah's first birthday party? I want it to be special, but I also want it to be about family, not about impressing people." "I would love that. And Margaret, I want you to know that if I could go back and change how I handled your grief after Harold's death, I would. I want you to know that your presence in our lives isn't just tolerated, it's treasured." As I sat in my living room that evening, looking at photos from Sarah's birth and the months since, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this place. The pain of Harold's death and the devastation of being excluded from my grandchild's baby shower had nearly destroyed my relationship with David and Jennifer. But that same pain had also forced all of us to examine what we really valued and what kind of family we wanted to be. The trust fund I'd dissolved in anger had been restored in love, but it was different now. Better. It was no longer just about providing financial security, but about ensuring that the values Harold and I had tried to live by would be passed down to another generation. Harold had been right when he told me I was stronger than I knew and had more power than I thought. But what he hadn't told me, and what I'd had to learn for myself, was that true power isn't about what you can take away from people. It's about what you can inspire them to become. Sarah Margaret would grow up knowing that her grandmother had fought for her family's integrity. She would learn that love requires respect, that relationships need tending, and that some things are worth more than money. She would understand that the greatest inheritance isn't what you leave behind in a bank account, but what you instill in the hearts of the people you love. And someday, when she was old enough to understand, I would tell her about the grandfather she never met, who loved her before she was born, and whose wisdom had helped bring her fractured family back together. For now, though, it was enough to know that Sarah would grow up surrounded by people who had learned the hard way that love is a choice you make every day, not a guarantee you can take for granted.